With the massive U.S. stimulus package winding its way through the domestic economy, the question looms about its impact on global markets. After all, it was the U.S. consumer that seemed to be lifting all boats during the boom. With some good news out of Europe and Japan, we are joined by Uri Dadush, an economist with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, to help us put it into perspective. Welcome to the program, Uri.
Thank you.
You know, there was recently, had been reported that there was the economies of France and Germany had experienced some modest growth in the last quarter. What does that mean for the rest of Europe? I mean, is it an optimistic sign? Should we be cautious? Analyze that for us.
Well, it's obviously a very positive piece of news that Germany and France, the two largest economies in Europe, have returned to growth, albeit very modest growth. Nevertheless, very serious questions remain about the sustainability of the beginnings of a recovery that we're seeing, essentially because the consumer in many countries remains very reluctant to spend in a very fragile situation. Unemployment continues to rise, foreclosures continues to rise. And this, by the way, is particularly an issue in the United States. Consumers in other parts of the world, most other parts of the world, are in reasonably good shape and can support a recovery. But the United States and some other countries that have been very badly hurt by the financial crisis, including the UK, Ireland, a few others, are clearly going to pull us back.
Do you think, though, that it's the beginning of a global recovery? Just explore that with us a little bit.
I think we are in an embryonic recovery. It's a fragile recovery. It's clear to me as I look at the data on production, most recently at the data on exports, which are beginning to add to global demand, that we are at the turning point or perhaps past the turning point. So actually the big question in my mind is not whether we are at the beginning of a recovery. The big question in my mind is how strong a recovery it's going to be and whether it is going to be sustained, hence my concern about the consumer.
Give us a sense of what's happening in some of the other economies and how that compares to the way that we're dealing with the global economic meltdown / signs of recovery.
Well, the initial effect of the crisis was very severe on the rest of the world. It was severe on the United States, but it was even more severe on many smaller economies that were dependent on foreign finance. And even today, in 2009, the collapse of output in the Baltic states, for example, to take an extreme example, is going to be about 4 times larger than that in the United States. GDP in these economies is falling at 20%. Also, some larger countries that were very dependent on manufactured exports, I'm talking about Germany and Japan, were also at least as badly hit as the United States. However, as we look forward, as the financial situation stabilizes, you're seeing these economies come back relatively rapidly. In the case of the United States, on the other hand, which was at the epicenter of the crisis, you have a lot of corrections that have to happen, whether it's with respect to the consumer balance sheet or the bank balance sheet, and that actually is going to take more time. So even though many economies were worse hit than the United States initially, they are actually in a position to recover more rapidly, whereas the United States will take more time because of the excesses.
How do you think it's affected the United States' preeminence as a world superpower, as having the world's strongest economy? There has been some talk about other countries perhaps sort of overtaking the United States. I mean, what do you make of that?
Well, clearly, a financial crisis in the United States, at the center of the financial system, is not a good thing for the United States, for its standing in the world, and for its relative position both in economic and let's call it power in a broad sense terms. United States becomes more dependent on the rest of the world, more dependent on other countries, less able to exercise leadership than it was before the crisis. However, here's the good news. The good news is that the United States was the world superpower by such a large margin that I don't think that we are in a situation where this is likely to change anytime in the near future. So United States emerges weakened, but it continues to be very much in the lead. It's very difficult to see how in the next 10 years, at least, and maybe 20 years, any single other country or bloc will overtake the United States in terms of economic leadership.
And the future of the US dollar as a reserve currency, what's the long-term, what's your long-term prognosis?
Again, the dollar, in my view, will remain the world's main reserve currency in the foreseeable future. Not because, to be perfectly frank, the United States has done such a great job of being a paragon of stability, but because there are really very few viable or no viable serious alternatives at the moment. I mean, if you look at across each of the blocs, the Europeans are still a diversity of country under an umbrella. There are still questions, whether it's correct or not, raised about the viability of the euro for many of the countries that are undergoing recession at the moment and would love to have more flexibility in their exchange and monetary policy than they have. Japan is in at least as much trouble as the United States is in terms of its long-term debt and aging problem, in fact considerably worse shape. It's of course a much smaller economy than the United States. China is the economy that in the longer run, if you look across decades, has the potential one day to become the world's leading economic power and a source of a serious reserve currency alternative to the United States. But China, too, is nowhere near fulfilling that potential. It's still a developing country. Its institutions are still relatively new, untested by history, by shocks. There is an issue of and a question of legitimacy about its governance. Its capital markets are not deep and well developed. Its currency is not fully convertible. So I think the world, for better or worse, is stuck with the US dollar in the foreseeable future.
All right, Uri Dadush, thank you very much for joining us on Foreign Exchange.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure.